Good evening. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jeff Shaman, and I'm professor and senior vice dean here at the Climate School. I'm also professor of environmental health sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University, and I have the distinct pleasure of moderating this evening's panel. The impacts of climate change become more and more apparent each day, and it's hard not to feel overwhelmed by the near constant news of severe storms, extreme heat waves, intensifying wildfires, and coastal flooding. These feelings of anxiety often come hand in hand with a sense of helplessness. What power do we have as individuals to help mitigate these threats? What is our responsibility, and what is our impact? I am joined by three experts who can provide insight into the relationship between individual action and large-scale impact, the history of climate change and climate action, and the steps each of us can take to make a difference in our homes and communities. Leah Aronowsky is an assistant professor of climate at the Climate School and co-director of the Undergraduate Special Concentration and Major in Sustainable Development here at Columbia University. She is a historian of science and environmental history whose research focuses on the history of climate science, climate denialism, and climate policy in action. Robin Bell is the Marie Tharp Lamont Research Professor of Marine Polar Geophysics at Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University. She is an expert on the structure of polar ice sheets and has led major expeditions to Antarctica and Greenland to study the implications of climate change on the polar regions. Finally, Sandra Goldmark is the Associate Dean of Engagement and Impact at the Climate School and a professor of professional practice at Barnard College. She is a designer and a leader in higher education focused on the circular economy, sustainable design, and interdisciplinary climate strategies. Thank you all for being here today. This session will begin with a moderated discussion, after which I will invite the audience to send in questions for our panelists through the Zoom chat box. So I'd like to start by setting the larger context. Robin, you study ice sheet dynamics in the regions that are changing the most rapidly. Can you frame our current climate outlook through the lens of your scientific research at Lamont?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The poles are a remarkable place because the signature of change is so clear there. It's the place on Earth that we can see the ice changing. And scientists like to make more than one measurement to be really sure of what they're up to. And in the poles, we can see the ice going faster. That's one measurement. We can see, because ice is kind of like mozzarella cheese, when you bite it, it stretches. And so in the same places it's getting faster, we can see it getting lower because it's getting stretched. So that's measurement number 2. Measurement number 3 is just we can measure how much the ice sheets weigh. And the places where they're going faster, getting lower, they're also losing mass. So for a scientist, that's kind of the gold standard. 3 measurements giving you the same message. The ice sheets are changing. Then you can just look around and you can see bathtub rims where fresh rock is exposed because the ice sheet is retreated. But that has impacts right here in New York. We actually, if you go down to take the Staten Island Ferry, there's a tide gauge that's been there since before my grandmother was born. And it measures every tide, up and down, kind of boring. But if you look, since my grandmother's been born, and this is where I'd like you to feel your leg, the ice, from the warming of the ocean and the new water in the ocean from the melting ice sheets, it's come up almost to your knee, 1.5 feet, since my grandmother was born. And it's going up faster. So those are like what's happening with the ice sheets and how we can see it at home. But whenever I talk to people, I like to go back to what the National Climate Assessment says. We can smell, taste, and feel climate change right here. We can smell it because when you put basil on your pizza or smell the daffodils, they're The daffodils come up earlier and the basil stays longer. You're smelling it because the growing season is 10 days longer since I started here at Columbia. Some places in the US, it's 40 days longer. So you can smell it. When the wildfires in the West start burning and you can't see the Statue of Liberty, you can feel it in your eyes when you start to breathe. You're feeling climate change. And then the third one is you can actually taste it. When you go to the local fish markets, you're no longer getting the same fish. The fish can move. And so, like, the fish have moved north. The lobsters have walked north. You don't get lobsters in Long Island Sound in Massachusetts as much anymore because they've all walked away from the heat. So everywhere from the clear science in the polar regions to what the National Climate Assessment says to what we can smell, feel, and taste points to the climate changing right here and around the globe.
Thank you. So we don't get lost in your food analogy. Also, I mean, what's really remarkable in what you said is 1.5 feet since your grandmother was born. And that, I remember, had real-world implications when we had Superstorm Sandy. It was able to overtop because the seawalls, I mean, it would have anyhow, but even more so because of that. Remarkable. Leah, you come to this field from a humanist's perspective. Could you highlight for us the evolution of climate action over time? What role has climate denialism played in shaping personal responsibility in societal actions?
So personal responsibility has certainly been weaponized by the oil industry in the past. And the classic example that I like to point to is the invention of something called the personal carbon footprint. This was a sort of tool that was invented by a public relations company on behalf of BP in 2004. And the effect of these kinds of maneuvers and tools that the industry puts out is to effectively put the focus of action onto the everyday virtuous actions on the part of individual consumers and to shift focus away from systemic change. Of course, this weaponization of personal responsibility is just one of the many ways that the oil industry has historically tried to defer or delay meaningful political action in climate change. Really, since the late 1980s and early 1990s, we've seen a sort of playbook emerge, taking a cue from the tobacco industry's strategies of casting doubt on scientific research. So we've seen everything from oil industries launching national ad campaigns that try to downplay the threat that climate change poses to humanity, to lobbying campaigns and think tanks that are funded by billionaire oil tycoons, all the way up to efforts to water down international climate treaties at places like the UN.
It's interesting that you pointed out that the playbook is so similar to what happened with tobacco. And I've heard that myself within this context. Do you think people see through that at all at this point, or do the same tools really work effectively in our current media ecosystems?
It's a good question. I think the sort of climate denial playbook has changed a little bit. I think we're seeing a shift away from casting doubt on the science or sort of weaponizing scientific uncertainty, and now toward arguments around climate change is not nearly as threatening as scientists make it out to be. We can live with it. These sort of less denial outright and more around a strategy of delaying meaningful change.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Sandra, you've spoken about how the connection between individual and large-scale efforts and how separating the two can actually slow effective action. What is the significance of individual actions in contributing to larger climate causes, particularly on the heels of what we just heard from Leah? And how has the weaponization of personal responsibility impacted these efforts?
I love two phrases Robin and Leah just did. Robin said signature of change, and then Leah, you started your answer with that, and then you ended yours with meaningful change. And I thought, there it is, right? We are living through this moment where the climate is changing so fast that we have to then change our societies, many of the ways that we live, especially here in the United States, faster than is comfortable or perhaps even normal. And so then we see very often this question, partly because of what Leah told us about, because of this twisting and warping, we're often asked, does what I do even make a difference? As if there's a choice between me doing something and systemic change, as if it's either or. And I think very strongly that it's both, that they go together, that there's a relationship. And I've been reading on this a lot, developing some courses around thinking through how do you help change happen in a system, whether it's an organization or really large scale. And I keep coming across in these really great thinkers. This gives me, helps me so we don't have to rely on my opinion, but there's amazing thinkers who've been writing about this. I was just reading last night Joanna Macy. She was referencing Margaret Wheatley, Mandela, Gandhi, Adrienne Marie Brown, and they all write beautifully about how small change can reflect, repeat, ripple, influence large-scale changes. I do want to come back to what Leah said. There are times when that has gotten twisted. My example, your example is the carbon footprint. Mine is the plastic bag, the cheap plastic bag that says on it, "Please recycle me." The bag is not recyclable. There's no market for it. It shouldn't have been designed or distributed in the first place. I can't recycle it effectively. That is a sort of warping and twisting of individual action. But I do think that it's really important that people feel that they do have agency. They are part of the change, and they can be.
If I may follow up on that, Sandra, I mean, it's such an important point that if the systemic infrastructure isn't in place to facilitate realistic recycling, to use your example, then it's just a facade. And are we coming to a point where we can distinguish what those facades are and what the real opportunities are? How do we do our homework? Let's put it that way.
On that simplest of things, people always say when we get into the epic recycling challenge conversation, I say, just recycle it, okay? If you're not sure and you're in front of a recycling bin, do the best you can to sort it properly. And I think you laid it out perfectly. Start talking about it. Start asking questions. Start raising your hand and asking places where you buy things if they have actual recycled content in their products, because then there might be a market for those things. So I think it's just as you said, it's a question of do the best you can and keep pushing and talking with others and raising your hand so that we can make it better.
Fantastic, thank you. Leah, I'm going to come back to you now. From a student perspective, how are they dealing with the question of individual power that you raised, and how do you help them grapple with this question through your teaching?
So this question of personal responsibility versus systemic change is really a very common theme in my classroom. I teach a class on the history of the climate crisis, and actually we talk about the history of recycling as an early example of sort of market-based approaches to environmental problems. And there, we have this conundrum, right? On the one hand, we've invented a system for recycling aluminum cans and glass bottles, and we've seen a real market change as a result. And at the same time, we've seen the weaponization of this concept of recycling. You use the example of the plastic bag. Of course, plastic in general is a thorny issue when it comes to what's actually possible for recycling. So here again, students are grappling with this sort of duality, I suppose we could say, of individual action having political potential and also sort of the potential for inaction at the same time. We also talk about, on the consumer side, individual actions. Electric vehicles are a huge point of conversation in my classroom, and we talk a lot about whether as you know, climate concerned people in the world, we want to simply swap out combustion engines for Teslas, or if we want to start to think about using climate as a vehicle for systemic change, right? And thinking about remaking our public transit infrastructure to be more equitable, these kinds of things. So, you know, I say all this, and I think it's really important to also note that my goal when we're having these kinds of conversations in the classroom is not to really encourage them toward one position or another, individual systemic change, but really give them the sort of critical thinking tools that they will need so that they can have some or arrive at some kind of informed conclusion on their own.
In some sense, you're drifting away from history more towards ethics, which is wonderful. You're saying there's a critical issue here. Let's reflect on this constructively.
Yeah. History is a great way to think about questions in the contemporary, right? And how you want to live your own life and what is possible and what has been possible in the past. Yeah.
I think I'm seeing a little passion there, right there, when you said that. I think that's wonderful. Robin, you're a fierce advocate for aligning lifestyle with personal values, as I've seen and understand. And you and your husband, environmental law professor Carl Copeland, sailed around the world on only 150 gallons of diesel fuel. Not to focus on Carl, but he also wrote a book, Live Sustainably Now, a low-carbon vision of the good life, detailing his efforts to cut back on his personal carbon output. Could you tell us a bit about your journey to live more sustainably and the challenges and joys that have come from that?
Well, you know, there are joys of, like, sailing around the world or riding an electric motorcycle. But there are also challenges when you say, well, am I going to do this or am I not going to do this? Because, you know, am I setting an example on what a low carbon life would be or not? I mean, so it's been wonderful living with somebody who is so deeply committed to what his impact is. And if I want to stay with him, I'm going to go along with it, or we're going to work together on this problem. And, you know, he's also, like Leah, really looked at the history of these things and, you know, looking at how individual action can make a difference, you know, whether it was abolition or prohibition. Both of those had individual actions wrapped up in those changes, some of which were successful and some of which took a long time. As an individual, it has been remarkable to realize that I, as a climate scientist, realize that if I'm going to be taken seriously and move beyond fear, which I think paralyzes much of us or makes us unable to do things, that moving beyond fear means taking action and living that life which demonstrates that you can have a rich, full life, even if it means giving up that heirloom, beautiful gas stove that both Carl and I love, and we can tell endless stories about. But, you know, with that comes the joy of learning to cook on an induction stove. So it touches as deeply in that in your life, but it also, slow travel is wonderful. You know, traveling 5 knots around the world makes you appreciate our planet and its scale much more than when you fly at 700 knots in an airplane. You actually get to smell our planet and see actually how few plastic bags we really did see. That was one of the wonderful, you could tell when you were getting close to human beings because there were more plastic bags. But it's that opportunity when we take a breath and decide we're going to do things a little bit slower, whether it's traveling by car or train, or in our case, because we love boats, by boat, we connect more with our planet, which is really our home, and the home that we're all talking about how we use the science we now know on how to keep it sustainable and a place we want to raise our kids and our kids' kids.
And then, you know, what you're touching on there, Robin, seems to me, it touches on something that you often find when you talk to climate change students, but also lay audiences, that there's sort of not necessarily despair, but there's a disconnect in where they have agency in this.
Right.
And what you're really talking about is that and you're doing it also with a smile and an amazing attitude about it, but there is agency to do things here that are meaningful, and that there is the conundrum about how that's spun and how that may not lead to systematic change, or systemic change, I should say. But there is agency to live a lifestyle that's consistent with your values if you value the earth, which I would hope we all do, right?
Right, and I think that those of us who are standing up to defend the earth have to show that we honor our place on it, and that we live in this remarkable time where we have this global knowledge that I can go on about how the ice sheets are changing. And from that, we can build the knowledge, assuming we keep on supporting fundamental science, of how we can live on this planet in the long run. Which, just think, my grandmother had no sense that the ice sheets were that big or that they were changing.
Yeah, amazing. All right, Sandra, as an authority on circularity and consumption, you're often asked, what is the one thing I can do to make a difference? This follows from what we were just talking about, but how would you answer that question in light of our discussion?
So I always use that question as a slight bit of the thin end of the wedge. And just picking up on what you were saying earlier, Jeff, I start with saying definitely start doing something because A, it feels good. As you said, we have agency. If you're feeling despair or feeling upset, taking action about it, this is scientifically proven, helps people feel better. So from a selfish point of view, start doing something. I also recommend people don't just do one thing. I heard Robin say this once, start doing something. The first thing, I think it can be almost anything. I recommend people think of an area related to their lives or sustainability that feels alive for them. Something where they have some skill or some interest. If you're super into food, maybe you're going to start with diet. If I was a designer, so I started with stuff and waste and dumpsters. Start where it feels alive for you and where you feel like you have a little something to offer. And then the last part of the wedge is talk about it. Tell other people what you're doing and why. And that, I think, is the key to moving from me, sailing around the world isn't going to solve climate change all by itself, or me, changing the way I shop or cook. But starting to talk about it and share with others is, I think, the first step towards a changing culture.
And the basis of civilization, as I understand and learned in high school, is communication. That's the first order of business to bring people together. You're all teachers of this here at Columbia. But what you're talking about really is something that anybody can engage in, right, Sandra? Communicating what they do. And it happens on all levels.
And I think that brings up sort of what we've talked about, is that talking and moving this subject forward, really, we all are members of communities. And to take this seriously, we have opportunities in our schools, at our jobs, at our churches, at places we volunteer, through governments, state, local, international, maybe national. We have the opportunity to turn levers many places. And we should not despair when one lever isn't working. There are other levers. And by looking across the board, and I love Sandra's approach of saying we need to communicate it, and my step on that is look where the communities you're in, where you can do that. It goes far beyond where you're employed.
And I think just to build on that, I think this is important because it means that almost, as you were getting to, Jeff, anybody can be a climate leader. Anybody can be a change maker. The person in the meeting who's, recently hired, maybe doesn't have a lot of power in that organization, but who raises their hand and says, wouldn't it be great if we had a sustainable option for our corporate picnic, like whatever, substitute in whatever thing, that person is has agency, is taking power, and can help. They may not have as much power as others in the organization, but it is a way, an important way to start.
And the other sort of, we've been talking a lot about individual action in terms of what you can do in your everyday life, and sort of how you can explore experiments in living, which I love hearing you talk about your travels. The other way that you can sort of feel like you're exercising agency, or in fact exercise agency, is by organizing politically, right? And starting to think about, here on campus we have a really active group called Sunrise that's trying to call attention to investment strategies and higher education around, and questioning whether fossil fuels should remain in investment portfolios at places like Columbia. You can also, of course, support politicians who make climate a central tenet of their political agendas and things like that. And so it's in a certain way, we don't always have to reinvent the wheel even, right? We can start to think about using the tools of democracy that is ultimately just a bunch of individuals coming together and organizing for meaningful change.
Fantastic. I do have a final question here that we can leverage off that I wanted to ask all three of you, which is that, in our efforts to curb carbon emissions and steward the climate and the planet, do you find cause for optimism? And could each of you give me one example supporting that positive outlook? Sandra, I'm going to pick on you first, I think.
I definitely take an optimistic approach. I don't even have to look for it. It's almost more like a choice to say this. We are living in a really extraordinary time, not just climate, but all of the changes and moments that we're living in right now. It's a huge challenge, and it can be overwhelming and scary. But we're gonna, hopefully live through this no matter what. And so we can choose to move through it with pessimism or with optimism. I'm not unrealistic, but for me, it's easier to do the work and move through my day from a stance of optimism.
Leah, what do you think?
Well, I'm optimistic. And the reason why I'm optimistic is I believe firmly that the future is unknowable, right? We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And that's also to say that our fate is not determined when it comes to climate, right? We're seeing major changes in the environment and in climate in general, but that doesn't mean that it's too late to take actions to mitigate the effects and to think about how to live with these climate impacts in ways that are more equitable. So I am optimistic. I think change can happen when you least expect it, and at historical moments when it seems most unlikely. And so I'm genuinely optimistic, even though times are tough in the climate world. As for an example, what gives me hope is people like Robin, who are, as I said, like living experiments and really showing what's possible in terms of living your values. And what I love about what you've done, Robin, is that you have shown that it's possible to live a life that's climactically sensitive, so to speak, but that feels joyful and rich, and it doesn't feel like it's just been about depriving yourself of wants. And I think sometimes the environmental movement and the climate movement can be unfairly accused of sort of wanting to restrict certain ways of life. But you're showing that there's really an enormous realm of possibility in terms of what you can do with a climate-sensitive life.
Well, I guess I'm last. I'm fundamentally an optimistic person. I think I would have given up a long time ago if I'm not. But the reason I'm optimistic in this space is because when I look back to where the water was when my grandmother was born, and our knowledge of the planet then, We have, as you know, humanity have built this remarkable understanding of how planet Earth works through fundamental science, from everything from how earthquakes happen to how ice changes. That, you know, what I still meet people my age who didn't learn about plate tectonics when they went to school. That's how new the ideas that many of us take for granted are. So we have, in our lifetime, built this knowledge of how the planet moves, how the planet works. And it gives us agency at a global scale that my grandmother didn't have, you know, and governments didn't have then. So it's this fundamental science knowledge base that's global that gives me optimism. And what's my one probably my most favorite optimistic story is how trying to adopt a lifestyle with a less impact can lead you to conversations you never would have had before. And my favorite is when my husband Carl and I and our daughter were in our motorcycle phase. And so we got electric motorcycles, which are actually incredible machines. They have incredible pickup. They're terrifying. We don't have them anymore. But it meant that I could talk to people who would have never talked to me if I told them I was a climate science from Columbia University. They would never have spoken to me. But instead of talking about my concern about the climate changing, we could start our conversation about why I was riding that incredible machine. And I was riding it because of my love of the planet.
That's fearless. I love that. I absolutely love that. The other thing I just want to note, I'm going off script here, is that all three of you are sort of imbuing the conversation with how much you love learning and understanding and research and scholarship, and that it's understanding this world that we live in that really, I think it motivates all three of you. I mean, I think I've seen that. Please correct me if I have this wrong, but there's a thrill there that's really tangible as I sit here that I think is wonderful.
I would add to that when you're a teacher, it's really easy to be optimistic. You are literally surrounded by amazing, bright young people all the time. And, you know, that is energizing and pretty easy to refuel yourself.
Yeah, well, try not to get too full of ourselves.
It's more the students, they bring it.
That's true. They keep us honest, which is great. All right, I'm going to go to some of the audience questions now. The first one we have is, how can we have productive climate conversations with people who distrust mainstream science? I think, Robin, this builds a little bit off of what you were just relating about your electric motorcycle venture.
Right, so that's one way you can do it, is by starting with a common interest. You know, there we were starting with motorcycles. You know, he had a Harley, I had a Zero electric. The other way is it's back to Sandra's conversation approach, is not to tell people about climate change, but offer them the evidence and say, this is what I'm seeing. What do you think this looks like? That's why when you take a politician to Greenland and they see the bathtub rings, they go, oh, but that's why you can ask me to talk about anything, sunken ships on the Hudson River or maybe climate change. I'm going to show you the data that goes with those 3 points I told you, the ice sheet speeding up, getting lower, losing mass. And I don't tell people it's changing. I'm showing them the evidence and say, this is the evidence. What would you think it looked like it's happening?
I might say something provocative, which is that I think you can talk about climate without ever talking about the science if you don't want to. I think there are lots of really important conversations to have around fossil fuels that have nothing to do with climate. You could talk about fossil fuel communities and the ways that they've been sort of left behind economically and also treated, exposed to horrible environmental pollutants as a result of extractive industries there. You could talk about geopolitics, right? You could talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fallout in terms of European natural gas supplies, those kinds of things. So there are lots of ways to talk about the very things that are causing the climate crisis without ever having to resort to data and scientific studies if you don't want to. Yeah.
I think we have very different approaches here. That's great. We need a whole assemblage of options. I'm going to go to another question that we have here, which is how can we make changes to live more sustainably when our political systems are slowing things down?
You want?
No, you go first.
Okay. Well, I think we have to stand up as citizens. We are scientists and scholars, but we're also citizens. We all are. So I think we must stand up and speak out. But we can, at the same time, act at that individual and look for those other levers.
Sandra?
I think about a lot these different streams of our society, right? There's the markets and the business stream. There's the political, legislative, policy stream, and then there's the culture stream. And they're not always, I'm sure there's other streams, but just thinking of those three, those are three big ones, right? And they're not always aligned in time. So I've heard people say recently, well, so many businesses have invested so much in green technology that ship has sailed for many businesses, and they're not going to claw back those investments. Some are, some aren't. But there's a way that some actions, some market changes are probably going to happen regardless, assuming some geopolitical stability. And, policy changes are clearly, in terms of climate, are clearly going in the wrong direction at the federal level right now, but there's a lot happening at the state level. And then culture moves in very strange ways, right? Fast, slow, upside down, turn around. So I think that maybe it's back to the sort of eternal optimist, but I do have faith that, as Robin said, there are multiple levers, and we can try to be pushing and pulling on levers in all three of those streams all at once, knowing that the policy is a critical piece, and right now we are not going to be seeing a lot of movement there, at least for the short term.
So I'll go into another question here, and one audience member asks, many climate solutions sound great, but what about people who can't afford to make those choices? Are these ideas really realistic or scalable for everyone?
Well, I think there's some sustainability choices are more expensive, but I think there's a little bit of a myth around that not everything that's more sustainable is actually more expensive, especially if you're looking at a household level or consumption patterns. There are ways to be greener that are actually quite a bit cheaper and more accessible. Not everything, and it's very important that we do make sustainable choices more accessible for more people. So I don't want to dismiss the question, but it's also not, for me, it's not a blanket where not everything greener is more expensive.
I'll add on to that and say, I think that there's another sort of angle onto the question, which is thinking about how to make everyday life more affordable for people who already live in places like New York City, which are actually pretty climate-friendly places to live, right? High-density housing, really good public transit. And so how do we find ways to ensure that people can remain in cities and actually even perhaps start moving toward city life rather than fleeing for the suburban lifestyle which would involve driving to and from work, to and from your child's school, single family homes, those kinds of things, which are much more energy intensive lifestyles.
All right, so another question we have is who can make the biggest difference in fighting climate change? Consumers, businesses, or industry?
All of the above. We really need to engage everybody. I mean, it's back to there are levers everywhere. We need to talk about it. We need to engage. I don't think there is a single lever, and I don't think there's a single player. If we're really looking towards the large-scale shift to a sustainable planet, then everybody has to play.
Yeah.
Couldn't put it better myself.
I think we have general agreement on that one then. All right. All right, so another one is, why is climate change getting less political support? And what could be done to turn this around?
You think you're the historian?
Well, I think it is clearly getting more and more politicized, right, over time, and that's profoundly depressing to me, despite my optimism, because I don't think this should be a political issue. And in some sense, my resistance to seeing it as a political issue is something I might offer about what's being done to turn it around. It goes back to what Robin said about talking with people, or what Leah said about, you don't always have to talk about climate science. People I talk to around the country and around the world, they feel, like you said, they smell and taste and feel the differences in the places where they grew up don't look the same, or the same bugs and little animals don't live there anymore. There's a beach near where my mother grew up, and there's no more sea urchins. When we were little, there were sea urchins everywhere, and they are gone. And I think a lot of people have that kind of profound noticing that the places that they know are very, very different. And that, to me, gives me hope that we can hopefully get past the political, because that's not political, that's personal, that is felt. And I think that there can be and is some consensus around that.
Robin, did you want to add something to that?
I'll add something that your sea urchins comment made me realize that one of the ways that a young scientist at Lamont's been pushing is a woman named Kirsty Tinto, who's working in Greenland on how do we connect climate change in communities. And it's one of these backwards ideas, is because you're close to the ice sheet, the sea level is falling. It's because when Leah stands up from that chair, the cushion's going to bounce up, just like the land's bouncing up. And what Kirsty found, that to working with communities, the way to get around the political question, and even there, the concept that the communities thought sea level was rising, even though they were seeing something else, was actually for the scientists in the community to work together on building that underlying map of the environment. So in essence, we mapped where the water was and where the sea urchins were, and through that, put the future projection. But doing it what mattered to the community. So suddenly, we ended up with projections of where change will be, where it matters to the community, and actually new words in the Greenlandic language to describe the change. But it came from, in essence, I thought about it because of what Sandra said. It came because we had the conversation about the environment, and the environment in which the community lives in. So I think there's something magic there about bringing people back to the planet, the environment, and then through that, seeing what the change that matters to them is.
Fantastic. We have another question, and it is, if big companies keep burning fossil fuels and aren't being held accountable, can individual actions make a difference in stopping climate change? If we are not all in this, is it possible for just the individuals to make a difference and stop climate change?
Putting the question of accountability aside, I do think that individual actions can make a difference in the sense of supporting the transition to renewable energy systems, right? And there, it varies country by country what that landscape looks like. And we are living through a retreat from the renewable energy transition in the U.S., but that doesn't mean that that renewables are over. Far from it. I think there are a lot of market forces that have already been put in place that are going to allow renewable energy systems to eventually become more and more the norm. And so individual action can, of course, exist outside of the question of accountability, which is a real challenge.
Another question, what can I say to encourage friends and family who feel helpless about climate change to take small, meaningful actions?
We're all in this together. It matters. You know, you may have been told that it doesn't matter, but you can do something, and you can encourage your friends to do something, and you can look for change in your communities. I think it's that we're paralyzed by fear and by being told that we have no power. We have power.
It relates to the question before, which was a really tough question. You know, the previous question, let's be clear, the answer is no. We have to stop burning fossil fuels, right? If we don't stop burning fossil fuels, I can recycle my plastic bag as long as I want, but that's not going to do it. But that doesn't mean then I shouldn't take my individual action because, again, back to my streams, culture is really powerful. We have to change the paradigm to some extent that we're living in, at least in this country, in terms of what's acceptable and what we accept from big companies. And one way I think that human societies change what's normal and what they accept is at a micro level, in the family, in the household, in the community, in the workplace, by saying, this is no longer culturally acceptable. And I think that hopefully might encourage people to say, maybe you don't run a big fossil fuel company and can't you know, put a cork in the fossil fuel pipeline right now, but we can all build a massive cultural shift.
I'll say too that what came to mind in response to that question was the comments that Sandra and Robin have already made around finding things that are small changes that bring you joy and that feel like they can become a part of your own sort of everyday lived identity, and at the same time are a way of living your own values.
So, you know, I think some of the questions that we're starting to get are also, though, nibbling at a slightly different issue, which the next question actually gets at, which is the urgency of the issue. And do we have time to be reactive? The question says, do we have time to solve climate change through usual government systems, or do we need big, fast changes now? And I think that's sort of one of the things that feeds people's anxiety, is that this is a large problem that's upon us, and small little incremental steps by each of us, particularly if the levers of the corporate world and the governments are not in lockstep with us, let's say, it may not be sufficient. What do you say to that? That's a harder question.
You know, I think that historically there's always been this debate about what kinds of political systems will be sort of most effective for addressing environmental problems. And I think that, you know, I work on the history of environmental politics in the 70s, where there was a lot of talk about sort of international governance mechanisms and sort of an aspiration for some kind of elite technocratic approach to global environmental problems, which of course have never really been enacted. I think what's more exciting to me is actually doubling down on democracy, right? We lived here in the US through big debates around the Green New Deal. We saw things, policies emerge in response to big scale demands for climate policy, and so we saw the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, passed here in the U.S., and I think that's a great example of democracy at work. The IRA was, of course, the biggest climate law that the U.S. ever passed, and it was also a deeply flawed law for many reasons, but yet we had something to work with, right? And so I think rather than thinking about sort of throwing up our hands and saying that our current political systems don't work, actually getting to work and doing the hard work of organizing is the only way forward.
And I actually think there's the what next question, right? How do we, as we've seen some of the threads that have gone through, how now do we see actions are under attack, science is under attack? How do we rebuild trust? How do we come up with solutions to move forward that are equitable? And how do we rebuild trust in that what I see as this wonderful network of knowledge, but somehow has become alienating to many. So there is work to be done on that democracy and communication front, is that I do think we need to think about how science re-ups its contract with society, is that we have to be able to articulate the importance of that web of knowledge, not just that we're going to drown you or maybe toast you.
So I'm mindful of time here, and I want to ask a final question to you all. What is the one big takeaway that you would want people to leave with tonight? Start with you, Leah. What's your takeaway for this?
My takeaway is pretty simple. I think my takeaway is that history has shown that change is possible and that change can happen even at the most unlikely of historical moments. And so I think it's really important to not resign ourselves to a sense that a climate catastrophe is inevitable. I think that big scale change can happen at any time. And countries, collectives can pivot at any moment, even when it seems like all the forces are pointing them in the opposite direction.
Robin, what would you say?
What would I say? I'd say that right now we are at a moment where individual action does matter, because individuals can look for those levers that they have. They have many levers because we are lucky we live in a democracy, because we have this wonderful knowledge base. And we need to figure out how to move forward. And that is by looking for change wherever we can. And maybe even, we didn't really touch on ways you might influence the business. How, in my cupboard, I have a blue bell jar from the nun who managed to get herself on all sorts of, in the room, because she managed to get sufficient stock to be able to be present at those conversations and vote it. So, everybody has levers to turn, and I think it's keeping our eyes open, because if we shut our eyes with fear, it's no good. Have you ever tried to drive a car with your eyes shut or sail a boat? It's a bad idea. So we need to keep our eyes open, and we need to be looking for that shared future built on knowledge.
Sandra, what would you say your one big takeaway you want people to leave with tonight is?
I guess I would pick up on a word that Leah used earlier. She said taking action can be a source of joy. And I really think that that's true. And I think that joy in action for the individual, I really do believe it is related to large-scale change, that there is a connection between small and large. And I think it's through action and through joy.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been wonderful. So thank you for joining us, to the audience here. And again, thank you, Sandra, Robin, Leah, for joining us here in person for such a fascinating discussion and for infusing what could have been a bleak conversation with a lot of hope and optimism, really. None of us are powerless in the face of climate change is the thing that I am hearing. It doesn't mean it's a simple problem. It doesn't mean it's something that we're going to solve rapidly. And it doesn't mean that we can't do it unless everybody really rolls up their sleeves in some way. But I'm hearing there is a lot of cause for optimism, and that people do have agency here that they can act on, and that's a really important perspective, because I've seen too many climate talks where people walk away a little bit despairing, and that's not what we're really here for. I think what we also saw is that our sustained daily choices have the power to give rise to larger movements, and perhaps bring each of us personal fulfillment along the way, even if doesn't necessarily mean we're going to take up electric motorcycles or come to the evolution to understand that they're actually terrifying, which I also got also. I've never been on one, really, that much. So anyhow, as we wrap up this session, I want to mention that tomorrow, October 21st, is Columbia Giving Day, our annual 24-hour fundraising campaign that seeks to advance transformative research and educational initiatives across Columbia University. This year, thanks to 2 anonymous supporters, the Climate School and Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory each have $50,000 in Giving Day match challenges. You've likely seen in the news that funding for climate and scientific research is facing challenges of its own, and your support means more than ever during this tumultuous time for science and higher education. Please join us by making a gift tomorrow and double your impact due to those matching gifts on the planet. We thank you for engaging with us tonight and invite you to continue supporting the Climate School and Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory by attending our events. Please stay informed through our newsletters or making a gift. Good night.